You're walking through dense forest 40,000 years ago, and somewhere behind you, close enough to matter, something large just shifted its weight in the underbrush. You don't see it, you don't hear it clearly enough to be sure. But something in your body has already decided the situation is bad, and your palms are sweating in a way they weren't 30 seconds ago. A very specific, very targeted kind of sweat. Not the kind you get from walking, the kind you get from being afraid. And here's the question nobody thinks to ask about that moment. What if the person walking next to you could smell that? Not see you sweating. Smell it. Smell the fear itself coming off your skin like information, and react to it before you'd even said a word. That sounds like something out of a werewolf movie. The idea that fear has a scent and other people can pick it up like a bloodhound. But this is not folklore. This is a documented, replicated, genuinely bizarre area of modern chemistry and psychology research, and the implications for how ancient humans survived as a group are honestly stranger than almost anything else we've covered on this channel. So let's get into it. Can humans smell fear? Could ancient humans smell fear on each other? And if the answer turns out to be yes, what does that actually mean for how small hunter-gatherer bands stayed alive? Let's start with the biology, because there is a very specific mechanism at play here, and it's not what most people assume. Human skin has two different types of sweat glands, and this distinction matters enormously for this entire topic. Eccrine glands are the ones most people picture when they think about sweating. They're spread across almost your entire body. They respond mainly to heat and exercise, and the sweat they produce is mostly water and salt, essentially odorless. Then there is a second, much less discussed type, the apocrine glands concentrated specifically in your armpits and a few other regions of the body. Apocrine glands don't really care about your body temperature. They respond to emotional states, stress, arousal, fear. And critically, the sweat they produce isn't the thin, watery stuff from your eccrine glands. It's thicker, it contains proteins and lipids, and on its own, fresh, it's actually close to odorless too. But the second it hits the surface of your skin, bacteria that live there start breaking it down. And that bacterial breakdown is what produces the smell. Body odor, in other words, isn't really sweat. It's bacteria eating your stress sweat and leaving behind a chemical signature as a byproduct. So here's the question researchers actually tested. If fear produces a chemically distinct kind of sweat compared to sweat from something like exercise, can other people unconsciously detect that difference? And the answer, across multiple independent studies, keeps coming back yes. One of the most cited studies on this came from researchers at Rice University and the State University of New York, who collected sweat samples from people watching either frightening films or exercising on a treadmill. Then had a separate group of participants smell those samples while their facial muscles and brain activity were monitored. The participants exposed to fear sweat showed measurable activation in a facial expression associated with fear itself, subtle muscle movement around the eyes, and brain imaging showed activation in regions associated with processing emotional and social signals. People weren't consciously identifying anything. Nobody said, "Ah yes, this sample smells afraid." The effect was happening below the level of conscious awareness entirely. Their bodies were reacting to a chemical signal their brain hadn't decided to notice yet. Let that sit for a second, because this is the genuinely strange part. This isn't about someone being able to consciously sniff a room and declare that someone in it is scared. This is about your nervous system picking up a signal from someone else's fear and mounting its own physiological fear-adjacent response without your conscious mind being in the loop at all. Fear at a chemical level might be contagious in the most literal biological sense, transmitted through the air, absorbed through your nose, and converted directly into your own body's threat response before you've had a single conscious thought about what's happening. Now here's where it gets genuinely useful from an evolutionary standpoint, and this is where ancient humans come into the picture directly. Imagine a small hunter-gatherer band, 20 or 30 people moving through unfamiliar territory. A predator is nearby. One member of the group catches sight of it first, or hears something, or simply senses something is wrong before anyone else consciously registers a threat. That person's body starts producing fear sweat immediately as a direct physiological response. Well, before they've had time to shout a warning, before they've had time to point, before language has even entered the picture. If the people standing near them could pick up that chemical signal and begin their own threat response automatically, you've just built a warning system that operates faster than speech, faster than visual signaling, faster than conscious thought. This is not a small advantage in a landscape full of predators that specialize in exploiting exactly the half-second of hesitation that comes before a group reacts as a unit. A group of early humans capable of transmitting fear chemically, group member to group member, without a single word being spoken, would have an edge that's almost impossible to overstate in an environment where the gap between reacting in half a second versus reacting in 2 seconds is frequently the entire gap between surviving an ambush and not surviving it. There is a term researchers use for this kind of signal: alarm pheromones. And while the word pheromone gets thrown around loosely in pop culture, usually attached to nonsense about attraction and chemistry between romantic partners, the actual scientific concept is considerably more interesting and considerably better supported by evidence, at least in the alarm context specifically. Alarm pheromones are extremely well documented across the animal kingdom. Ants release them when crushed or threatened, triggering nearby ants to become instantly more aggressive and alert. Fish release chemical alarm signals into water when injured, causing nearby fish of the same species to scatter immediately, even if they never see or hear the actual threat themselves. Rodents produce alarm pheromones so reliable that laboratory researchers use synthesized versions of them specifically to study stress responses in other rodents without needing to expose the second animal to any actual threat at all. The mechanism is ancient, it's widespread, and it shows up again and again across species that evolved along completely separate branches of the animal kingdom, which is usually a strong sign that a trait is solving a genuinely fundamental survival problem rather than being some evolutionary fluke that happened once and stuck around. Humans obviously are not ants and we're not fish, and the fear sweat research doesn't claim humans have some dedicated, specialized alarm pheromone system as clean and mechanical as an ant colony's. But the core finding that human sweat produced under fear carries chemical information that other humans detect and react to below conscious awareness sits comfortably inside this much larger pattern that spans an enormous range of the animal kingdom. We may not have evolved a purpose-built alarm system the way ants did. We may have simply inherited and refined a general mammalian capacity to pick up threat-relevant chemical signals from other members of our own species, a capacity so old and so deeply wired that it still fires today in a species that also has language facial expression. And every other more sophisticated communication tool you'd think would have made a chemical alarm system redundant a long time ago. Here's a detail from more recent research that makes this whole picture considerably more specific and considerably stranger. A study published by researchers in the Netherlands looked specifically at whether fear sweat affects how people process ambiguous facial expressions, faces that are difficult to read clearly as either fearful or neutral. Participants exposed to fear sweat were significantly more likely to interpret ambiguous faces as fearful compared to participants exposed to neutral sweat from the same donors under calm conditions. In other words, smelling someone else's fear doesn't just trigger a vague generalized alertness. It appears to actively bias how you interpret other social and visual signals around you, tilting your perception of an uncertain situation toward danger. For a group of ancient humans navigating unfamiliar terrain, that's not a minor quirk of brain chemistry. That's a survival-relevant bias, priming the entire group to interpret an ambiguous situation as more dangerous the moment one member's body has already started reacting to a threat correctly or not. And that raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with for a second, because every advantage like this comes with a cost attached, and this one has a cost that's almost too on the nose. If fear spreads chemically through a group faster than conscious thought, that means false alarms spread just as fast as real ones. A single person spooked by something that turns out to be harmless, a shifting shadow, an animal that wasn't actually a threat, a misread sound in the dark, could chemically prime an entire band toward heightened fear and danger interpretation before anyone had a chance to verify whether the original threat was real. Panic, in other words, might have had a genuine chemical transmission pathway among ancient humans, spreading person to person through smell alone, independent of whether the underlying threat that triggered it was ever real in the first place. The same system that let a group react instantly to a genuine predator could just as easily turn a false alarm into a stampede. This actually maps onto something anthropologists have long observed anecdotally in accounts of hunter-gatherer group behavior. Cases where a single person's evident fear or distress appeared to spread through an entire group with a speed that seemed to outpace any verbal explanation of what was actually happening. Historical accounts of mass panic in crowds, going back centuries, describe exactly this pattern, fear apparently transmitting through a crowd faster than information about the actual threat could travel, leaving people reacting to the fear itself rather than to whatever originally caused it. Modern crowd psychology researchers have documented the same phenomenon in stampedes and panics, describing a contagion effect that spreads through visual and auditory cues. But the sweat research raises a genuinely open question about how much of that classic panic contagion effect might have a chemical component running underneath the more obvious visual and auditory signals researchers have traditionally focused on. So where does this leave us on the actual archaeological question? Whether ancient humans, specifically tens of thousands of years ago, were relying on this mechanism. And here's the honest limitation. Sweat doesn't fossilize. There is no archaeological site anywhere on Earth that's going to hand researchers a preserved sample of Paleolithic fear sweat for direct chemical analysis. What we have instead is inference built on two solid pillars. First, the biological mechanism itself, apocrine glands. Fear-triggered sweat, bacterial conversion into detectable odor is universal across modern humans, regardless of population or geography, which strongly suggests it's an ancient, deeply conserved trait, rather than something that emerged recently in some specific population. Second, the broader evolutionary logic, chemical alarm signaling, exists across an enormous range of species, facing the exact same fundamental problem ancient humans faced, coordinating a group response to danger faster than deliberate communication allows. Put those two pillars together and the conclusion that ancient humans were almost certainly picking up and reacting to each other's fear sweat. Whether or not any individual band member ever consciously understood what was happening becomes considerably more than idle speculation. It becomes the most straightforward explanation available for a trait we can still directly observe and measure in every living human today. Think about what that actually means for a small Paleolithic band, moving through unfamiliar country, every member's body constantly, and involuntarily broadcasting a small stream of chemical information about their internal emotional state, and every other member's nervous system constantly and involuntarily receiving that broadcast, adjusting their own alertness and threat perception in response. All of it happening beneath conscious awareness, all of it happening before anyone had said a single word. Language gets all the credit for human coordination, and reasonably so. But underneath language, older than language, there may have been a second communication channel running the entire time. One you can't consciously control. One you're still running right now every time your palms sweat in a meeting you're dreading or a hallway you don't feel safe in. You're not imagining it when you walk into a room and something feels off before anyone said anything. That feeling might be older than the room, older than the words you'd use to describe it, older than every institution and technology that separates you from the person walking through that forest 40,000 years ago. Some information was never meant to be spoken. It was meant to be smelled.